We're delighted to welcome you back to the last session of the day of 14 Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, straight from the Diggy Palace. It's a pleasure to present today Trumpet Up, the Era of Neo-Nationalism, Homi K. Bhabha in conversation with Sanjoy K. Roy. The seeds of the storming of the capital were sown and shown to the world early in President Trump's presidency with his chest-thumping belief in what commentators have called dangerous nationalism. Scholar and critical theorist Homi K. Bhabha, a believer in more benign and inclusive worldview, evaluates how you address these actions rooted within the fabric of chaos, discontent and uncivil unrest. A session that analyzes the growing instances of neo-nationalism around the world also discusses how this narrative is trying to redefine democracy, political power, public ethics and success in troubling terms fueled by conspiracy theories. In conversation with Sanjoy K. Roy, Bhabha delves on the new era of politics and what it entails for our future. Homi K. Bhabha. Homi is the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities in the English and Comparative Literature departments at Harvard University. He was founding director of the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard University from 2011 to 2019 and director of the Harvard Humanities Center from 2005 to 2011. Bhabha is the author of The Nation and Narration and The Location of Culture. He has written on contemporary art for Art Forum and has written a range of essays on William Kentridge, Anish Kapoor, Terence Simon and Matthew Barney amongst others. Sanjoy K. Roy. Sanjoy is an entrepreneur of the arts, is the managing director of Teamwork Arts, which produces over 33 highly acclaimed performing arts, visual arts and literary festivals in 40 cities across the world, including the iconic annual Jaipur Literature Festival, international editions of JLF and the launch during lockdown digital JLF Brave New World series. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section on your screens. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting Trumpet Up, the Era of Neo-Nationalism, Homi K. Bhabha in conversation with Sanjoy K. Roy.
And welcome, Professor Homi Bhabha. Thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this continued conversation that we've been having on the Jaipur Literature Festival platform, looking at issues of nationalism, rights, human beings, human rights, and so much more. I'm going to first ask you to, as agreed, that you will provide us with your thoughts on what we've seen in America in the past few months. Homi, Professor Bhabha, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjoy, and I want to thank the Jaipur team. It's very different being in Cambridge and speaking to Jaipur and then speaking from Jaipur, but I hope we will be able to do that before too long. President Biden's inaugural address made frequent references to the fragility of democracy. In his first presidential town hall with CNN's Anderson Cooper, 5 weeks later, Biden returned to the subject of democratic fragility. In the time between these two warnings of the perilous state of democratic institutions and values, all Americans and most of the rest of the world witnessed the violent panic on January the 6th in Washington, D.C. Now, is the fragility of democracy any different from our ongoing apprehensions about the fate of democracy, or what we call the future of democracy? Does the phrase democratic fragility strike a different note of alarm? I believe it does. The value of words lies in using them carefully and reading them cautiously. The future of democracy anticipates the next chapter in the democratic experiment, however dark and difficult it may be. The fragility of democracy, on the other hand, I believe, expresses the anxiety that democracy may have lost the plot, as we put it, in the present moment. There may well be another chapter, but we don't quite know how to write it. The Democratic victory in the 2020 elections may well turn the page. But what is the plot of the story now? With over 74 million Americans voting for Trump and over 100 congressmen refusing to endorse the election, in the very wake of the violent ransacking of the Capitol in Washington, the plot against American democracy is far from over. Well into this February, 3/4 of Republican voters still believe the lie that the election was stolen. It is no wonder that Biden chooses his words cautiously when he speaks repeatedly of the fragility of democracy as a real and present danger. Now, the United States is by no means the only country vulnerable to democratic fragility. The insurrection at the Capitol is an instructive symptom of fragile democracy worldwide in authoritarian regimes on a global scale. To learn that lesson, consider for a moment the Make America Great Again monument erected by the insurrectionists across from the Capitol. What was that monument? The insurrectionists built a towering gallows with a dangling noose ready to lynch the American elections and placed it in the face of the Capitol. The hanging gallows were part of the theater of mob protest, accompanied by chants of hang them and stop the steal. But the lesson of this piece of political theater, and there is always political theater, is clear. The Make American Great Again gallows, as I call it, that installation of insurrection, casts a shadow of death across the face of the Capitol and the democratic values it is meant to represent. On February the 6th, the hanging gallows, as you know, were meant for Democrats and Republican never-Trumpers, to say nothing of the vice president. On that day, the American Constitution almost got it in the neck. However, the lynching gallows immediately brings to my mind's eye another part of American and world history. In America, it brings to me the specter of American racialized death, death by lynching, death by slavery, death by police chokeholds for blacks. After all, the gallows and the noose, like many American trees in the South, were the instruments of death for black people. And indeed, the same is true if we think about the gallows as a symbol of the death by genocide for Native Americans going back hundreds of years. This, I believe, is the American nightmare from which the American dream never fully wakes. And why we see the death of democracy played out on that January 6th, as we see the phantasmagoric opposition to the elections, we must also remember that the violence visited upon black and ethnic bodies by white supremacists over decades is now turning itself on the American body politic. The racial barbarism that terrorizes the lives of black and ethnic citizens within democracy now terrorizes electoral democracy itself. The shadow of death does not enter the corridors of power uninvited. Internal terrorists and political vigilantes across the world, mobs, gangs, insurrectionists, enter the public domain when truth is in peril. When a political system suffocates the people's right to speak truth to power in any number of legal ways by alleging that dissent is sedition and protest is anti-national, then the checks and balances of representative democracy are threatened by dogmatism and demagoguery. a fragility of democracy is dangerously exposed, and democratic dialogue becomes mired in alternative truths and conspiracy theories. Timothy Snyder, the most prescient commentator on tyranny, whether it emerges in fascist states or democratic nations, Timothy Snyder, the professor of history at Yale, considers the post-truth condition as a grievous malady of democratic fragility. Snyder writes, post-truth is pre-fascism. When we give up on truth, we concede power to those with the wealth and charisma to create spectacle in its place. Without agreement about some basic facts, citizens cannot form the civil society that would allow them to defend themselves. A joint statement, he goes on, by Ted Cruz, issued about the senator's challenge to the vote, nicely captured the post-truth aspect of the whole. It never alleged that there was fraud, only that there were allegations of fraud, allegations of allegations of allegations all the way. And I ask you to remember this phrase, allegations of fraud, not fraud. Post-truth has defined the unjust and precarious world occupied by minorities for centuries the world over. And when we think of the threat to democracy represented by conspiracy theories and allegations and post-truth, let us not forget that racialized, ethnicized minorities have lived the life of post-truth for longer than we care to remember. Minorities are excluded, discriminated, vilified, and criminalized on the grounds of nothing more, very often, than allegations of allegations of allegations all the way. They are violated and denigrated, not for what they do, but for who they are. Allegations referring to skin color, allegations connected to caste status, allegations relating to religious belief, allegations associated with differing political views, allegations aimed at gender identities and sexual preferences, require no proof so long as those who make them are protected by post-truth power and enforced by post-truth policies. The gallows erected at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. on January the 6th, I submit, serves as a warning that if we do not urgently muster our will to democratic freedoms and to the equality of minority populations and dissent, then the fragility of democracy might well be a prelude to its fatality. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Bhabha. And there is just so much to unpack in what you have said. I'm going to go straight off to ask you about some of what you've contended. Before that, can you, for our audiences, just make the difference between what you talk about as post-truth and how you differentiate that from alternative truth that you write about?
Alternative truth is a very slippery concept, but it assumes that there is another set of truths out there to which it is providing an alternative. Now, normally, we know that facts can be contested, data can be queried. So normally we assume that there are alternative readings or interpretations. So alternative truth works in that area, although when it is empowered by leaders and Democrats, that alternative truth starts becoming a new form of truth, or what we might call post-truth. It is not simply saying, is in any pluralist democratic society, that there are several versions of the truth, let us discuss them. Now, when alternative truths are put forward at a time when there is a real problem about what the common good is, where there is no proper mechanism even in place for saying we're in different political parties, different views, but there is a common game that we're playing. When the common good falls out of the way, alternative facts and alternative truths are in serious danger of not just being interpretational, free discussion of differences. They're in danger of becoming or entering this realm of the non-truth.
So Homi,
the post-truth.
Through history, we've seen that the demagogue has always sort of relied on selling his version of his truth, whether it's Hitler or Franco or whoever it is, and they've all, like Trump, been elected. I think what has surprised certainly people like us sitting many thousands of kilometers away from you is that despite everything, despite the very same Congress men and women being elected on the very same way as President Biden was, you still had 100 of them denounce the fact that this election was fair and proper in terms of precedent. And this, what you say, the alternative truth, which now has come to be seen as post-truth, has come to be the narrative. And as you have referred to in your note, 74 or 75 million people still believe that the election was stolen. So how does this happen? I mean, history continues to repeat itself. What is it that these people are able to sell for people like you and me to buy into this alternative truth? What are the bases or what's the foundations on which this operates?
Well, this is a very large question to unpack. But first of all, let me say, what it shows up dramatically is that democratic formalism, right, on which we depend on democratic procedure. People go and vote at the place. They go and put a postal ballot. Democratic procedures are not enough. For democracy to survive its fragility and its future, democratic procedures are only one step of the way. What we actually need are deep commitments to democratic values. So I think that's the first problem, that this is not a problem simply of formalism or institutions. They're important, but that cannot be the only answer here. The second thing, Sanjoy, and I think here we should be very modest, is that you said, what is it that allows you and me to believe, to buy into these ideas? Now, the fact is that you and I don't buy into these ideas. And I'm not saying that as a form of elitism or setting us apart as holier than thou, not at all. I'm saying that to suggest that I believe profoundly that there has been a massive failure in education for citizenship. We may produce great scientists, we may produce great technical engineers, we may produce software geniuses, we may produce great businessmen, but education for citizenship, which is what generally the liberal arts and the humanities nourish, the notion that whatever knowledge you have, it carries values. Knowledge is related to power. That when we receive knowledge, we have to be educated to be able to be critically, to be able to deal with it, to sift the chaff from the wheat. I'm suggesting to you that there is no easy political fix to this. The fix to this is to think of education for civil society as Timothy Snyder suggests, education based on values, not simply on outcomes.
Professor Bhabha, let me take that argument back to you. You're talking about education. Again, going back to history, hasn't philosophers and thinkers always been at risk? I mean, it's not today, whether it's all the time from the Greeks to Socrates and Plato and so on and so forth. Even today, have you and people like me who are supposed to be part of the thinking a part of society, have we failed to communicate our ideas of what we think is a liberal society to these people who've turned back and said, your society is useless. We want somebody like Trump because of X or Y or Z reason, or Erdogan, or Xi Jinping, or Putin, or Duterte, or whoever across the world. And also the second part of the question is that perhaps, again, looking back into the history, are we as human beings, as society, easier when we have a strong ruler with that sense of kinship, where we gather around a particular person and his or her charismatic ideas, good or bad?
Well, Sanjoy, first of all, you're absolutely right to suggest that many people of great learning bowed to fascism. One of the greatest philosophers of our time, Heidegger, one of the great philosophers, invoked more and more now in the realm of climate change, no less, and in many other ways. They did bow to it. They did bow to it. And again, here comes the corruption of power. They bowed to it not only to save their skins, but they bowed to it, and there are many others, because they felt empowered, and they, in a way, exceeded their philosophical learning or their philosophical teaching to think that they could shape a whole world where they only understood very superficially what the power would be, what the power structures would be. That's why many great, there is the great arrogance of learning also. People who feel that they are so philosophically sophisticated that somehow in these moments they can make a intellectual grab for power. And I think that there was a lot of that. I mean, Wagner also sympathized with authoritarianism. And this can come because you feel that your work can speak suddenly to a world in change. And that's my reading of it. And I think, therefore, you're absolutely right to say that the most unexpected people have followed the drumbeat of fascism and dogmatism. So that's my first issue. The second point is to think it's not that we have not been able to communicate great values or great virtues from our position. I'm arguing the other way around, that I think even we are vulnerable not to think about education as expertise and outcomes and success, and not to think about education as education for civil society and education for the notion of human well-being, whether you're a citizen or you're a resident or a migrant. I'm saying, and you can see this on a world historical level, there has been a devaluation of humanistic education. And I'm saying that amongst ourselves, amongst the elites, even amongst the elites, there is often a huge deficit for humanistic education in the service of society, in the service of humanity. I lay that down to you. When you have this deficit, when you have this deficit of a kind of humanitarian, ethical, aesthetic, political education, then at that level, you create notions, deeply unequal and unjust notions of what is success, measured by your bank book, measured by the home you have, measured by the clubs you belong to, measured by where your children can go or not go. And that lack of an understanding across society, from the elites right down to the working class, that lack of commitment, that deficit of education for civil society, for civil social justice, that then creates a sense of ressentiment, resentment, and anger. And that anger is in many ways justified. The problem with that anger, it seems to me, is that it can lead to conspiracy theories and non-truth theories or post-truth ideas, which are often manipulated by those very leaders, in the case of certainly of Trump, leaders who have always belonged to the class of the privileged, leaders who have gamed the system, leaders who have been openly alleged, there are allegations of fraud, allegations of lying. So it seems to me that these leaders are not only are not charismatic, these are miasmatic leaders. These are leaders of not charisma, but of miasma, producing fog around themselves as aura. And these leaders are very difficult actually to get hold of. And because of that, you can identify and project on them whatever you need. Think about that phrase, allegations against allegations, allegations all the way down. Think of Trump's most charismatic statements. These are not kind of statements of clear direction. Trump's typical rhetoric is, some people say X, I don't know, but people are saying X, and these people, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know, are good people. You see the way in which the rhetoric continually creates a fog of conspiracy, a fog of enmity, leaving himself directly off the hook. So I want to say that these so-called strong leaders rule not by strength, except in their direct actions, but they entrance the people by these foggy weaknesses, ambiguities, which then the disadvantaged, those who have not had the advantages of education, have to hold on to. I was seeing a CNN report last night where they were interviewing people who said quite clearly that within a week or 2 weeks, I can't remember, Trump is going to be brought back and a new cabinet and a new presidency will be announced. I saw
the 20th of March is the date that they're giving.
Yes, and I saw last night a conspiracy theorist say, as you must have seen too, but worth reminding ourselves, to Anderson Cooper, yeah, I did call for your execution. I do think these leaders should be executed. What kind of fantasy is that? My last point, when we think now of post-truth, we should not say this is post-truth, that is truth. To understand what's going on, we have to think of public as being the foundation of otherwise rational action. There's a paradox here, a very important paradox.
Professor Bhabha, in your great passion, you've sort of drifted to the left of your screen. I need you to center yourself.
I was never a centrist. I never sat in the middle, but here I am.
So three thoughts to what you've said. One is, you talked about elites, and in going back to history, the Brahmins of our time in India, and the Brahmins sitting in Cambridge like yourselves.
I'm a Boston Brahmin, if a Brahmin at all, but I'm a Parsi, and a proud Parsi, and there is no caste system amongst the Parsis.
Well, that too can be argued.
There is a class system, not a caste system.
So even within that, we as intellectuals, one is held on to knowledge and information, and like the Brahmins have, they've only sort of, because they know that they are the gateway to the other. Has the democratization of this process of allowing for information to get out that we've seen through the social media, which started as a cause for good and continues to be, but is being used in many ways to allow information and knowledge to be used by everybody. Everybody is now, in many ways, has a voice, and most importantly, has a voice which is anonymous, because it doesn't matter whether somebody knows you or me. They're not coming into our drawing rooms or our classrooms to have a conversation which is considered, but they can, in their anonymity, put out hatred in the way that that swamps the complete narrative. So that's one. The second question is that yesterday in a conversation that we were having with Justice Albie Sachs, as you know, who wrote the constitution for the South African country, for South Africa, one of the things he said is that democracy is evolutionary. It'll continue to evolve. What is absolutely important are the institutions. And how do you preserve an institution? By having the best person in the institution in that job. Can it be argued, Homi, that over this past, not just the 4 years, but ever since the advent of the Tea Party movement, you have systematically, as we've seen in India and many parts of the world, we have systematically removed people of knowledge and experience and replaced them by more what you have said, people who have a particular point of view, the demagogy of that point of view. So is that the second problem that we're looking at? Because when we're looking for a solution in the future, how do we then manage, or how do we control this democratization of information and marry that to be able to ensure the robust need for institutions, which in its turn will protect democracy? Because obviously, to some extent, as America has shown today, Professor Bhabha, that democracy can't just be protected by the vote. The vote in itself is being questioned, and not being questioned in a country anywhere in the third world or in the far off of Asia or Africa. It's being questioned in the very capital of democracy, at the Capitol Hill.
Two immediate responses, and then I'll go back to your substantive questions. Two remarks. One, from my own presentation, this morning, my time, evening, yours, I think it must be clear that even democracy in its most evolutionary form has to come to terms with the ongoing injustice, the ongoing allegationary post-truth that still ties this democracy, and has done for a long time, to injustice towards African Americans, Native Americans, and many ethnic. So that within democracy, that's why I call it fragile. Within democracy, even the most evolutionary democracy, as you put it, even within those systems of democracy, there are these patches, these gaps of justice, and those and violence. And this is not simply injustice in the courts. This is violence on the streets. We have to deal with this. And I think what we say about this country, its imperfect democracy, and its failings in very specific ways towards, I'm suggesting, dissidents and minorities. I'm not saying it just fails in every way. It fails in many other ways too. This is as true in India or in Turkey. The targeting of certain groups within evolutionary democracy as not being equal and as having different kinds of institutional treatments. I think that whether it's through the police force or whether it's through the ballot box, I think this is something we've got to realize. Part of the evolution of democracy is its own error, is its own blind spots around race, minorities, migrants, dissidents, and so on, gender issues, so on and so forth. So when we talk about the evolution of democracy, it's not an evolved system. It is a system with deep, profound imperfections at the level of who is a citizen and who is not. who has the rights of citizenship and who doesn't have not just political and social rights, but the rights on the public highway, who is secure and who is not. So let's not have a rosy picture of a democratic evolution. Let's think about that there have been these huge deficits, as I've called them, and gaps. So that's my first issue. The other point I want to make here is that the social media, the horse is bolted from the stable so far. We have not seen an appropriate and adequate regulatory system. You know, you take somebody off Twitter in one place and they find another way to be heard in another place. So this is a defeat at the moment, and this is a huge dilemma at the moment. It seems to me that one has to work on trying to see how one can regulate using the law, using other democratic institutions. But I think you hit on something very significant, which is anonymity. Now, public voice was never supposed to be veiled. From that, you begin to have allegations unsupported, or you begin to have a conspiracy. That I do not want to individualize it. I'm not saying that every individual simply has to present themselves in the public domain, showing their faces, giving their names. But I am saying that normally protest, dissent is associated with an organization, somebody with a leadership, with a structure of representation. You see what I'm saying? Usually opposition is represented. It's a representative organization. Now we have freewheelers who come in, and the freedom of social media, so vaunted, is not necessarily democratic, because the whole nature of representation, if you think about anonymity, is not being followed. That's one. So who takes responsibility for what you say? The other thing is that democratic it may be in terms of access, but is it so democratic in the fullest sense of democracy at the level of practice? I don't think it is. People get on, go into their own groups or their own cells. They have a huge power of repetition, but only to listen to themselves. So I think when we talk about voice, we have to talk about something which is more intangible but hugely important, which is the ethics and the equity of structures of listening. We have so emphasized the need to express one's views that we have lost the mechanisms and the morality of learning to listen. And I think that this is, for me, an absolutely important element now, because it is only through listening that you can move from information to knowledge. Because through listening, you learn to sift. You learn to put yourself in another's place and then look back upon yourself. This is not some sentimental sense of identification that I identify with all those who are voiceless. No, you go there, you listen, and you come back and think about your own position and how it might change. This whole dialectics of listening is institutionally now trumped by the dialectics of, being free to say and express whatever you like. Also here, my dear Sanjoy, let's think that many of our leaders in the world will not speak in a measured and regulated way. They will either keep silent or they will only address large crowds. Press conferences based on listening and actually responding to specific problems are out the door nowadays. Press conferences are only places where policy or positions or defensiveness or defenses are made, and then that's all. It's partisan, defense made, position, and then retraction, or utter rudeness. We will not take this question. Censorship. So I really think that there are many practices of this kind that need to be thought about before we get a regime of regulation. Let me just say that the last trip I took around these very days last year before COVID was to Cape Town. And when I was there, I met with Albie Sachs, and hanging on my wall here is a version, a blown up version of the Constitution, which he signed for me. So when you mention it, I think about him. Albie, if you're listening, all the very best.
There's a lot that I would want to challenge you to, Professor Bhabha, because you really unpacked a lot of stuff. But unfortunately, we are hurtling as usual to the end. There's so much more to talk about, especially in terms of, I wanted to ask you really about the whole issue of going back to elitism. Is that one of the issues that we're looking at? Is the sense of meritocracy that only the people who are able to succeed are successful, everybody is not? And is that the basis? And I'm going to go straight into questions because we have not more than 4 or 5 minutes left. And I'm going to club the questions and hold our conversation for a later moment. Emma asks of you, Professor Bhabha, if one is to assume history works in a cyclic motion, isn't this swing towards the right-wing politics just that? And can one assume that this wave shall settle as well? And Zara asked, do you think that the fire Trump stoked was just him bringing up issues that were brewing amongst a certain population? Did he simply provide a ground for this resentment to fester? Does that imply that this problem formed well before Trump?
Well, there are many theories about how history works. There is a linear theory that you go from A to Z, which is called the teleological theory. There's a cyclical theory. I think it all depends on where you stand on this. If I think it could be cyclical. I'm sure that this moment will change. We know that with the Biden election, something has changed. There has been a coalescence now between the popular vote and the college vote. This is more than we've seen for a long time. So things do change, cycles do break. You don't have to believe in the cyclical theory of history to see that. I think what you do see is the ways in which demography changes, populations change, effectivity of political education changes. I think there are many things that happen. So I would not want to lay my bet on a theory of cyclical history or a theory of linear history. I do lay my bet on the fact, in a way, that progress is much more contingent and unpredictable. And in order to effect that kind of change, we have to work at all kinds of levels. And I think that's what happened. Georgia flipped this time. Georgia flipped because of Stacey Abrams has been working relentlessly to increase the fund of knowledge and bring in the black voters who are not voting.
And, not just the American Georgia, Professor Bhabha, but even the Georgia, which used to be part of the the USSR.
That's right. But at the moment, I have the American Georgia on my mind, as the song has it. So I just mentioned. Bhabha,
I'm going to ask you to add one other point to this, because we've got 2 minutes left. To the point about Trump, please also look at, Amia asks, how does American exceptionalism and patriotism shape mindsets leading to the rise of populism? And how do you think it will stop?
In 2 minutes, I can do justice to nobody. But let me say, yes, of course. There have been major shifts of populations between the Democrats and the Republicans. Why did two-term Democrats voting for Obama, a man of color, then shift to Trump? I think this has got to do very much with economic circumstances. I want to take up here the question, yes, meritocracy is a real problem, but I think the problem that precedes it, which I've argued for, is an educational equity based on the education for citizenship, not simply outcomes and profit and the market. So I think that to deal with it only at the level of meritocracy is actually to deal with the symptom rather than the cause. That's my response to Sanjoy. I also think that American exceptionalism has been, it would be good if it were true, but unfortunately it is not true. And I think before we talk about any American, before we talk about exceptionalism, we have to talk about the role internally and externally that America has played. Is the role of the exclusion of populations who are your citizens, and I'm sorry to keep harping back at it, but I see this as a kind of watermark of the situation. Does that make you an exceptionalist power? You are an exceptionalist power, and you create a world hegemony based on the fact that your view of your exceptionalism does not include the exclusions, the inequalities that are the inbuilt deficits of American democracy. So I think that this idea of exceptionalism can only be seen, in my view, can only be qualified and has to be put in its place to see what it has done. And not only internally, but what it has done externally, because very often American exceptionalism in foreign policy is a seduce and abandon project. We need,
and we're seeing an effect. We're seeing the knockdown effect as we speak on Myanmar. Professor Bhabha, as usual, just as we've got into this conversation and we're on a roll, so to speak, we're having to stop the conversation. Look forward to continuing this in our ongoing series. Always a pleasure to have you on the Jaipur Literature Festival platform and unpack your mind and all the vast knowledge you have. Thank you for being here. Back to our colleagues at the Jaipur Literature Festival.
Thank you. Thank you to the audience. Thank you, Sanjoy. Thank you to our colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Homi Bhabha and Sanjoy, for such an enlightening conversation. It's always a delight to hear both of you together. Thank you very much for being part of this conversation. We would like to thank our celebration partner, Diageo. And thank you all for watching and being such a lovely audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would love for you to support us at Teamwork Arts. Any contribution is welcome and would help spread knowledge and ideas seamlessly against all odds. You can also tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 @Jaipur Literature Fest. Remember, the festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.
And welcome.